Usually, when we appraise the value of something, there is a set metric we all agree on.
Uh-huh.
You look at a house, you check the square footage, you look at the neighborhood, and you review the recent sales in the area.
Right. It is very visible. It is measurable.
Yeah, you can put a number on it, and you can defend that number with hard data. But then you step into the realm of how the creator evaluates human activity, and suddenly our standard appraisal system is just completely broken.
It really is. We are looking at a valuation metric that is, honestly, it is shocking.
Right. What we price as highest, heaven often prices as worthless. So, welcome to Reformed Thinking. Today we are taking a focused look at how God views our religious activity.
And we are doing that by dissecting a single razor-sharp sentence from Scripture. That is Proverbs chapter 15, verse 8.
Yes. For this deep dive, we are going to unpack the startling contrast between a wicked person's expensive sacrifice and an upright person's quiet prayer.
That single sentence, I mean, it forces us to ask a difficult question about the nature of our own religious habits. It strips away all that external gloss.
It really forces us to look at the hidden mechanics of the heart. The contrast in that proverb is jarring because it targets the very things we humans use to measure our own goodness.
Oh, absolutely. We love visible metrics. We love knowing, we put in the effort, spent the money, or showed up to the event.
Yeah, and Proverbs 15.8 takes all of that visible effort and places it on a scale that measures invisible motives.
Which is a terrifying thought, honestly.
It is. So, to set the stage for you, let me share a historical story from our material. It involves the famous 19th century evangelist D.L. Moody.
Oh, this is a great story.
Right. He was in Edinburgh, Scotland, and he was speaking to a crowded hall filled entirely with children. We are talking about hundreds of kids in this cold stone building in the 1800s.
Just a massive sea of youth.
Yeah. And Moody wanted to get their attention, so he leaned over the wooden pulpit, looked at this sea of young faces, and he posed a question. And he fully intended to answer it himself to set up his sermon. He simply asked the room, "What is prayer?"
And he was completely unprepared for the response.
Yeah.
He expected that typical silence you get when you ask a rhetorical question to a room full of kids.
Yeah, the blank stares. But instead, scores of little hands shot up all over the hall. These children were super eager to answer.
So he decided to call on one young boy.
Right. This child stood up and fired back with a flawless, comprehensive theological definition. The boy said, "Prayer is an offering up of our desires unto God for things agreeable to his will in the name of Christ, with confession of our sins and thankful acknowledgement of his mercies."
Wow. And Moody was so stunned, he just looked at the boy and said, "Thank God, my boy, that you were born in Scotland."
It is wild. What stands out there is the sheer theological density a child possessed in that era. When you analyze that boy's definition, you see a highly structured understanding of who God is and who we are.
Yeah, the boy did not say, prayer is asking for whatever we want. He said, it is offering our desires for things agreeable to God's will.
Right. He included confession. He included thanksgiving. Our material argues that when you contrast that Scottish boy's definition with our modern landscape, a devastating shift has occurred.
It has. Contemporary religion has largely traded that robust, objective theological framework for a kind of superficial emotionalism.
We have reduced prayer to a form of cosmic manipulation. We treat it like a therapeutic exercise designed to get what we want.
Yeah, rather than a posture of dependent submission to a holy God.
We really have to unpack this because the authors are telling us we have fundamentally misunderstood what God actually wants from us.
And to help us visualize this, our materials introduce a brilliant metaphor from John Piper's book, The Pleasures of God. He contrasts a mountain spring with a watering trough.
Let's think about a watering trough for a second. If you have ever been on a farm, you know a watering trough is inherently dry. It is a large, empty container.
Right. It requires a constant hewn bucket brigade.
Right.
You have to haul water from a river, carry it up a hill, and dump it in just to keep the trough functional.
So if you want to glorify a watering trough, you have to work yourself to the bone filling it up. You have to supply what it lacks.
Yeah, the trough needs you. Without your buckets of water, the trough is entirely useless to the animals that need to drink.
But a mountain spring is completely different. A mountain spring is self-replenishing. It overflows continuously from its own internal depths.
You do not bring a bucket of water to a mountain spring. The water is already rushing out of the rock.
And our material stresses that God is completely self-sufficient. He possesses no deficiencies that human beings could possibly supply.
We do not glorify him by trying to fill him up with our religious works or our ceremonies or our sacrifices.
No. We glorify a mountain spring by getting on our knees, cupping our hands, and drinking from its overflow to our heart's satisfaction.
The theological term for this is aseity, which means God has life in and of himself. He does not depend on anything outside of himself for his existence or his happiness.
So, attempting to enrich an infinitely rich God is a subtle form of arrogance.
It really is. It implies he needs us to keep his operation running. True prayer does not enrich God. It confesses that God is abundant.
True prayer declares, "You are the giver, I am the receiver, you are the one who is sufficient, and I am the one who is needy."
It feels like we often treat God like a divine GoFundMe campaign, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. We act like our prayers, our church attendance, and our good deeds are financial donations keeping him operational.
We think we are funding his enterprise, and we want our name on the donor wall.
But if he is the mountain spring, bringing him a bucket of our own water borders on insulting. You would not walk up to the edge of Niagara Falls and dump a bottle of tap water over the side, expecting the falls to be grateful for your contribution.
Spot on. When you bring your bucket to the spring, you are fundamentally misunderstanding the nature of the spring.
Right. It means the pressure is off to perform and prove your worth, but the demand for total honesty is absolute.
It demolishes the legalistic mindset that says we can purchase divine favor through our religious achievements. It forces us to come with empty hands.
So why did Solomon even need to write this proverb in the first place? Were the ancient Israelites actually trying to bribe God?
To grasp this, we need to shift backward and understand the environment of Solomon's era. Our sources take us back to the ancient Near East to look at the surrounding pagan cultures like the Canaanites and the Mesopotamians.
You have to understand how those neighboring cultures viewed the concept of sacrifice. They operated on a strictly transactional system.
Yeah, ancient paganism was essentially an economic exchange with the divine. The gods provided weather and fertility, and the humans provided food through animal sacrifice.
Our sources point to ancient myths like the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Atrahasis epic. In those stories, the gods get annoyed with how noisy humans are, so they decide to wipe out humanity with a massive flood.
But they failed to realize a major flaw in their plan. Without humans around to offer sacrifices, the gods had no food supply.
The imagery used in those ancient texts is incredibly revealing. After the flood, one human survives and builds an altar to offer a sacrifice.
And the myth describes the gods smelling the roasting meat and swarming like starving flies around the burning altar.
Wow, starving flies.
Yeah, they were desperate for sustenance. They were finite beings who depended on human activity for their very survival. They needed the humans just as much as the humans needed them.
So the pagan worshiper believed they could literally bribe, feed, or manipulate their gods through the mechanical performance of a physical ritual.
The mindset was, I give you this goat, so you have to give me rain for my crops.
Right.
It was a binding contract based on mutual need.
That was the constant temptation for the ancient Israelites. Solomon's audience lived right in the middle of this transactional mindset. It was the air they breathed.
And they began to adopt it and apply it to the temple in Jerusalem. They started believing they could manipulate Yahweh by mechanically performing the physical rites of the temple service.
They assumed that as long as they provided the blood and the smoke, God was obligated to bless them, regardless of how they lived the rest of the week.
Basically, the Israelites were treating the temple like a spiritual insurance policy.
Right. They were paying their premium on Sunday with a sheep. They assumed that physical transaction covered their account, so they could live in complete autonomy and ethical rebellion on Monday.
They were oppressing the poor, lying in business, and ignoring justice.
But they felt completely safe because they handed over a goat on the weekend.
They thought the smoke of fat rams would create a literal smokescreen, hiding their daily conduct from God's view. They separated the ritual at the altar from the reality of their hearts.
That is why the prophets constantly yell at Israel, telling them God hates their festivals and their sacrifices.
It was not because God changed his mind about the temple system, but because the people had turned the temple system into a pagan bribery scheme.
We really need to look at how the book of Proverbs addresses this. Our material points out that Proverbs uses a specific poetic structure called antithetical parallelism.
Yeah, antithetical parallelism is a hallmark of Hebrew wisdom literature. It presents a truth in the first line and then contrasts it with its absolute opposite in the second line.
It forces the reader to choose between two distinct paths. There is no middle ground. You are either on the path of wisdom or the path of folly. You are either righteous or wicked.
Before we even get to verse 8, I want to look at verse 3 of that same chapter because it establishes the atmosphere for everything that follows.
Okay, let's hear it.
Proverbs 15.3 says, "The eyes of the Lord are in every place, keeping watch on the evil and the good."
That is the omniscient gaze. If God is a starving deity swarming like a fly, you can trick him. You can throw him a piece of meat and go about your business.
But if his eyes are in every place, beholding the evil and the good, you cannot hide behind religious smoke.
Right. He sees through the external performance directly into the hidden motives of the worshiper. He sees what you do in your living room and in your boardroom just as clearly as more. He sees what you do in the sanctuary.
Our sources draw a direct line between verse 8, which talks about the sacrifice of the wicked, and verse 9, which talks about the way of the wicked.
God evaluates our religion from the inside out. He connects what happens at the altar with how we conduct ourselves in the marketplace.
It is all connected for him.
I have to ask a question on behalf of the listener here. If God explicitly commanded these sacrifices in the Mosaic Law, he laid out the rules in Leviticus, he specified the animals, the altar, the procedures.
Right, he gave very clear instructions.
So how can the act of obeying that direct command be considered wrong just because the person's heart is not perfectly aligned? Isn't doing the right thing still doing the right thing?
I see what you're getting at.
Like, if a father tells a kid to take out the trash, and the kid takes out the trash while grumbling internally, the trash still gets taken out. The father's command was obeyed.
It is a valid question, but it assumes God's law functions like a human chore list. The divine command was never meant to be a standalone mechanical action divorced from faith and repentance.
So the action itself wasn't the entire point.
Exactly. The physical sacrifice was ordained as a shadow, a type, meant to point to a deeper spiritual reality. Bringing the animal while harboring active rebellion in your heart is not obedience. It is hypocrisy disguised as obedience.
That makes sense.
Let me explain it this way. If a husband gives his wife a beautiful bouquet of roses, but he bought them to distract her from the fact that he is secretly emptying their bank account, the roses are not a loving gesture.
Oh, wow. Yeah, the roses are actually an insult in that context.
God does not just want the roses. He wants the heart of the person bringing them.
We really need to dig into this specific Hebrew vocabulary our sources provide to see the weight of this. Let's break down the first half of Proverbs 15.8.
Okay, let's do it.
The phrase is Zevach Resham tu Evat Yahweh. Let's take those words one by one. First, Zevach, which is translated as sacrifice.
A zivuk was a communion sacrifice. It is vital to note that this was not a cheap offering. It was an expensive, elaborate, and highly public act of covenantal worship.
You brought a valuable animal from your flock, a prime specimen without defect. It was slaughtered, the blood was handled by the priest, and a portion of it was burned on the altar.
And then the rest of the meat was used for a communal feast with your family and friends right there at the sanctuary. It was highly visible and socially prestigious. Everyone saw you doing it.
So the person bringing the zevach looks amazing to the community. They are funding the religious institution and throwing a barbecue for their friends at the same time.
Yeah, they look like a pillar of the community.
Yeah.
Now let's look at the people bringing it. The Rishaim, translated as the wicked.
When we hear the word wicked, we tend to think of criminals or villains in a movie. We think of people robbing banks or committing violent crimes.
But in biblical wisdom literature, the Rishaim are the unregenerate. Let me clarify what unregenerate means for our listeners.
Please do.
It refers to someone whose heart has not been made new by God's Spirit. They are living in functional independence from God.
So they might be highly respected in society, they might be wealthy, they might be the ones keeping the temple financially afloat.
Right, but their hearts are completely autonomous. They want to run their own lives. They do not submit to God's rule over their private decisions.
What is God's verdict on their expensive public offering? The word is ta'eva, translated as an abomination.
Toeva is one of the strongest words in the Hebrew language for rejection. It denotes something that is morally and spiritually repulsive.
What makes this even more striking is how the Greek translation of the Old Testament, the Septuagint, translates it.
Yeah, they use the word belugma, which is associated with rotting, rancid matter. It describes something that causes physical nausea. It makes your stomach turn.
Let's synthesize this. The author of Proverbs is saying that the most solemn, expensive religious ritual, when offered by an unrepentant person, is literally rancid to God's senses.
Sacred form cannot sanitize an evil source.
You can wrap a piece of rotting meat in the most expensive gold foil. You can tie a beautiful ribbon around it, but it still smells like rotting meat to the one who can smell through the foil.
God smells the autonomy and the pride, and it makes him sick, regardless of how much the animal cost.
It shatters the illusion that we can balance a ledger of cherished sin with public religious activity. You cannot buy off the judge of the universe with a portion of your wealth while withholding your allegiance.
No, you absolutely cannot.
Now we look at the second half of the proverb, the contrast. The Hebrew phrase is tefilat yesharim ritzono. Let's break this down just like the first half.
The first word is tefilat, which means prayer.
Notice the contrast in cost and visibility. A zevak cost a valuable animal and required a public altar. It required a priest and a whole production.
Tefillat is a simple, spoken, or even silent expression of need. It requires zero financial cost. It requires no physical altar.
It can be done in complete isolation, locked in your bedroom, or walking down a quiet street.
And who is offering this prayer? The Yeshurim, translated as the upright.
We must clarify what upright means here. It does not mean sinless perfection.
Right. If it meant sinless perfection, it would lead every single listener to absolute despair, because no one listening to this has a flawless moral record.
In wisdom literature, Yeshurim denotes a straightness of direction. It describes a justified sinner.
Let's explain justification simply. It is God's legal declaration that a person is right before him, not because they never sinned, but because their sins are forgiven by grace.
The upright person is entirely honest about their sin. They do not hide it behind religious rituals.
They rest on divine grace and seek to walk in the right direction, and when they stumble, they confess it.
And then we get the verdict on their prayer. Ratzin, translated as his delight.
This is where we see a massive theological inversion. Our material reveals that in the book of Leviticus, ratzin is the highly technical priestly term for God accepting a slaughtered animal sacrifice.
When an Israelite brought a flawless offering and it was burned on the altar, the priest would declare that the sacrifice was accepted. It was ratzin, well-pleasing to God.
Solomon takes this highly specific, blood-soaked sacrificial term and applies it exclusively to the simple, costless prayer of a justified person.
It is like taking a Medal of Honor meant for a battlefield general who just funded and executed a massive million-dollar military campaign and pinning it on a helpless private who simply keyed his radio and called in for air support.
That is a great way to look at it. The private did not fight the battle, he just asked for help. But he gets the highest commendation.
God takes the highest language of sacrificial acceptance and bestows it on the empty hands of a dependent petitioner.
The expensive sacrifice of the independent person makes God nauseous. The quiet prayer of the dependent person brings God absolute delight.
God is most glorified not when we try to pay him off, but when we admit our total bankruptcy and ask him for grace.
This raises a major logical dilemma, though, for anyone reading the text closely.
Yeah. If acceptable prayer requires an upright heart, a straight heart, we have a problem. The Apostle Paul tells us in Romans 3 that none is righteous, no, not one.
Every human heart has a bend toward autonomy.
So how can anyone listening to this actually pray without God finding it offensive? We just established that an unregenerate, autonomous heart turns religious activity into an abomination.
If we stop reading at the Old Testament, that tension remains unresolved. The dilemma is real. But our material points to the Christological fulfillment to resolve this.
Jesus Christ is the only human being who is naturally and perfectly yashar, the true, upright one.
His heart was completely straight from birth to death. He lived in perfect filial dependence on the Father.
Filial dependence means he lived with the perfect trust and obedience of a true son toward a loving father. He never once acted in autonomy.
Our sources note that his prayers were intrinsically delightful to the Father, which was declared audibly at his baptism and his transfiguration.
When Jesus was in the water, the heavens opened, and the voice from heaven said, "This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased."
That is the ultimate declaration of ratzin, of absolute delight.
Furthermore, Jesus replaces the zevak, the physical sacrifice. The animal sacrifices were always meant to point forward to him. They were temporary placeholders.
Jesus offered himself without blemish, shedding his own blood on the cross, which ended the need for animal blood forever.
He is the perfect sacrifice and the perfect praying priest. He's the only one who brings both a flawless offering and a flawless heart.
So where does that leave us? If Jesus is the only perfectly upright one, How do we become the Yeshurun whose prayers are a delight?
Through the concept of union and mediation, we can only be considered upright through imputed righteousness.
Let's break that down for the listener. Imputed righteousness is like a banking transaction.
Imagine you have a bank account, millions of dollars in debt, and a billionaire steps in.
Right. He not only pays off your massive debt so your balance is zero, but he also transfers his entire fortune into your account.
When the bank looks at your ledger, they see his wealth. When we place our faith in Christ, his perfect record of uprightness is credited to our account.
Our stammering, weak, distracted prayers do not ascend to heaven on their own merit. They are perfumed by Christ's perfect obedience.
The sources describe Christian prayer as fundamentally Trinitarian. It is offered to the Father through the mediation of the Son by the help of the Holy Spirit.
We do not just toss words up to the ceiling. The Spirit helps us in our weakness. The Son takes our imperfect prayers and presents them to the Father.
And the Father receives them with delight because he sees his Son.
That is how a holy God can take unmixed delight in the prayers of sinners. He is not ignoring our flaws. He's delighting in the righteousness of his Son, which covers those prayers.
Our prayers are acceptable because our mediator is acceptable.
So the author of our material takes this ancient verse and points it at the modern landscape.
The author uses Proverbs 15.8 as a lens to critique several massive contemporary theological frameworks. We are going to impartially outline the author's arguments here.
We want to trace their logic and show how this ancient text is being wielded in modern debates without taking a side ourselves.
It is fascinating to see how a single proverb can be applied to complex modern systems.
The author takes the core principle that God rejects mechanical religion and demands dependent faith, and aims it like a spotlight at various systems. The first target is Roman Catholicism, specifically the dogma of ex opere operato.
Let's explain ex opere operato for those who might not know. This is a Latin phrase meaning from the work worked.
It is the doctrine that grace is conferred to a person through the sheer physical performance of a sacrament like the Mass or baptism, provided the ritual is done correctly by an ordained priest.
The author asserts that treating the ritual itself as a mechanism for grace resurrects the transactional sacrifices of the regime.
The argument presented is that if grace is dispensed automatically by a physical ritual, it shifts the focus away from the internal faith of the believer and places it onto the external performance of the act.
The author argues this attempts to purchase favor through a mechanical process, rather than resting solely on a posture of empty-handed dependence on Christ's finished work.
Then the source turns to Arminianism, focusing heavily on the concept of sovereign human free will.
Let's clarify the terms here. Arminianism leans heavily on synergism, which is the idea that salvation is a cooperative effort between God's grace and human free will.
God offers salvation, but the human must use their independent free will to accept it.
The argument the author presents against this is a strictly logical one concerning the nature of prayer for the lost.
If human free will is the ultimate deciding factor in conversion, the source argues that you cannot consistently ask God to save a soul.
Why? Because to ask God to save someone would be asking God to override their free will. If God respects free will above all, he cannot unilaterally change a resistant heart.
Therefore, the author claims that true, consistent prayer demands a monergistic view.
Monergism means God acts alone to regenerate a heart.
The author argues that when you pray for someone's salvation, you are implicitly asking God to perform sovereign heart surgery, to change their will from the inside out.
Which proves that deep down, every praying Christian relies on God's sovereign hand, not human capability.
The source also points this proverb at the prosperity gospel and seeker-sensitive pragmatism.
These movements are critiqued for treating God as a domestic intercom designed to order up carnal luxury. You push a button, say a specific prayer formula, and God is obligated to send down health, wealth, and success.
The author contrasts that with the idea of prayer as a wartime walkie-talkie. A walkie-talkie on a battlefield is not used to order room service. It is used to call for supplies and air support to advance the mission.
The critique here is that the prosperity gospel reverts entirely to the pagan transactional mindset of the ancient Near East.
It treats God as a mechanism to be manipulated. You give a specific amount of money as a seed, and God is contractually obligated to multiply it and give it back to you.
It uses religious formulas to manipulate the creator for material gain.
The author also addresses critical race theory, or CRT.
The source argues that CRT and various Marxist frameworks define righteousness and moral standing through collective guilt and societal power dynamics.
In those systems, your moral standing is often determined by which identity group you belong to, and whether that group is historically privileged or marginalized.
In contrast, the author believes Proverbs 15.8 strictly defines uprightness through adherence to absolute moral law and individual imputed righteousness before God.
The author argues that before the judgment seat, God does not evaluate people based on collective group identities or sociological theories of power. He looks at the individual heart.
He demands an individual recognition of sin and an individual reliance on the righteousness of Christ.
I have to offer some pushback on behalf of the listener here.
Yeah, please do.
The author places an enormous amount of weight on this single verse from Proverbs. We are talking about one sentence written nearly 3,000 years ago, and the author is using it to dismantle massive, highly complex modern systems like Catholicism, Arminianism, and modern sociological theories.
That is a lot of heavy lifting for one sentence.
Does the text actually support all of these specific modern applications? Or is the author taking the general concepts of internal faith over external works and stretching it to its absolute limits to score theological points?
It is a very fair critique to suggest the author is putting a massive amount of weight on one structural pillar. You have to be careful when applying ancient wisdom literature directly to modern sociological frameworks.
However, what the author is attempting to do is trace the root of each modern system back to the exact same humanistic assumption that Solomon was confronting in ancient Israel.
Which is the desire for control. We want to be in the driver's seat.
That is the core issue. Whether it is a mechanical ritual where the action guarantees the grace, an elevation of human free will where we make the final call on our salvation,
Or a formula for financial prosperity where our donations force God's hand.
or a sociological redefinition of morality where we define the terms of guilt and innocence. The common denominator is a desire to control the terms of our relationship with God.
We want to manage it through human mechanics or collective definitions, rather than resting in sovereign grace and desperate dependence.
The author argues that Proverbs 15.8 is a timeless axe striking at the root of human autonomy. It shows us that we are the creature and he is the creator.
This brings us to a massive shift in perspective that you, the listener, need to make. The movement required here is going from attempting to bribe a starving deity to drinking deeply from an overflowing mountain spring.
The command of this text is to approach God with completely empty hands, pleading the merit of Christ alone.
We must abandon the idea that we can establish leverage with the Creator. We bring nothing to the table that he needs.
The most freeing realization a human being can have is that God does not need us to keep his universe running, yet he delights in our dependent cry for help.
Let me leave you with a final arresting consideration that builds on everything we have covered today. Consider this. What if the most spiritually dangerous place you could possibly stand is not in a den of obvious iniquity?
What if the most dangerous place is not out on the street committing visible crimes?
What if the most dangerous place is sitting comfortably in a pew on a Sunday morning, participating in a flawless liturgy, singing the correct hymns, and putting money in the plate while your heart remains totally independent from God?
If God's highest delight is found in our desperate dependence, then our polished self-sufficiency might just be the very thing keeping us furthest from heaven.
The appraisal system is totally inverted. The empty hands are valued above the full ones. God rejects the proud who try to pay him, and he embraces the broken who simply ask for mercy.
It is a hard truth, but a beautiful one.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into Proverbs 15.8 on Reformed thinking. Until next time, keep checking the source.